I'm Sarah, 28, and last Tuesday night changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. What started as a casual dinner invitation from my parents turned into the most calculated betrayal I've ever experienced. Mom's famous lasagna sat untouched as Dad slid loan papers across the table, $40,000 for my golden child brother's third failed business venture. They expected me to sign without question, like I always had before. But this time was different. This time, I had a plane ticket burning in my purse, and they had no idea what was coming. Before we dive into this family revenge drama, I need to know, what do you think happened next? Did I sign those papers and stay trapped in their manipulation, or did I finally break free? Drop your predictions in the comments below, smash that like button if you've ever felt used by family, and make sure you're subscribed because this story has twists that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood loyalty. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming. The tension in that dining room was suffocating. Mom fidgeted with her wedding ring while Dad maintained his usual stern expression, the one he'd perfected during my childhood whenever he needed me to comply without question. My younger brother Jake wasn't there, of course he wasn't. He never had to face the uncomfortable conversations about money, responsibility, or consequences. "Sweetheart," Mom began, her voice sickeningly sweet, "we know this is a lot to ask, but Jake's really learned from his mistakes this time. This new venture is different. It's going to work." I stared at the papers, my name already typed in the borrower section. They'd prepared this ambush meticulously. The loan was structured so that I'd be the primary borrower, with them as co-signers, meaning if Jake's business failed again, I'd be stuck with the entire debt. My credit score, my financial future, everything would be on the line for their precious son who'd already burned through 2 businesses and left a trail of unpaid debts. "You've always been so responsible with money," Dad added, his tone suggesting this was somehow a compliment that should make me grateful for the opportunity to risk everything. "The bank approved you instantly. Jake's credit is, well, you understand." Oh, I understood perfectly. I understood that Jake had spent the last 6 years being bailed out of every financial disaster he'd created. I understood that my parents had always seen me as the reliable one, the one who'd sacrifice her own dreams to clean up everyone else's messes. I understood that they'd invited me here tonight not because they valued my opinion, but because they needed my signature. What they didn't understand was that I'd been planning my escape for months. The plane ticket in my purse was for a flight to Portland, Oregon, where I'd already secured a job at a marketing firm that would double my current salary. I'd found an apartment, transferred my savings to a new bank account, and even arranged for movers to pack my belongings next week. I'd been methodically planning my exit from this toxic family dynamic, and tonight's ambush was just the confirmation I needed that I was making the right choice. "I need to think about this," I said carefully, watching their faces fall. "What's to think about?" Dad's voice carried that familiar edge of irritation. "It's family, Sarah. Family helps family." But as I sat there, looking at the 2 people who'd raised me to be their perpetual backup plan, I realized they'd never actually seen me as family. They'd seen me as a resource, a safety net, a reliable source of financial support for their real priority, my brother Jake. The irony was perfect. Tomorrow morning, while they'd be wondering why I wasn't answering their calls about the loan papers, I'd be on a plane to my new life, leaving them to face the consequences of their manipulation for the first time in years. Growing up in our suburban Chicago home, the hierarchy was crystal clear from day one. Jake could do no wrong, and I could do no right, no matter how hard I tried. While I maintained straight A's through high school and worked part-time jobs to save for college, Jake coasted through with CS and DS, his failures consistently explained away by my parents as creative differences with the educational system, or he's just too advanced for his teachers to understand. The pattern started early and only intensified over the years. When Jake crashed Dad's car at 17 during a joyride with friends, I was somehow blamed for not being a better role model, and had my own car privileges revoked for a month. When he got suspended for cheating on his SATs, Mom spent weeks on the phone with admissions officers, crafting elaborate stories about his learning disabilities and test anxiety. Meanwhile, I graduated valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University. You'd think this would have warranted some celebration, maybe a dinner out, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, the conversation at my graduation party centered around how Jake had found his passion in entrepreneurship and would be starting his first business, a food truck that specialized in gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches. Jake has such vision, Mom gushed to relatives who politely asked about my college plans. He's going to revolutionize comfort food. Sarah's just doing the traditional thing, you know, following the crowd into corporate America. The food truck lasted 8 months. Jake had ignored basic business principles like permits, health codes, and customer service. He'd purchased the most expensive truck he could find, hired his friends instead of qualified employees, and spent more money on Instagram marketing than on actual food ingredients. When it inevitably collapsed, leaving him $25,000 in debt, guess who got the tearful phone call at midnight during my sophomore year finals week? Sarah, honey, we need to talk about helping your brother, Mom had whispered into the phone, as if she was afraid Dad would hear her admitting they needed my help. He's learned so much from this experience, and he just needs a little support to get back on his feet. That little support ended up being my entire summer savings from my internship at a marketing firm, $8,000, that I'd planned to use for living expenses during my junior year. Instead, I spent that year eating ramen noodles and working double shifts at the campus bookstore, while Jake moved back home and spent his days playing video games, supposedly researching his next venture. His second business was even more spectacular in its failure. Convinced that he was destined to be a tech entrepreneur, Jake borrowed $35,000 from our parents, money that had originally been set aside for home repairs, to develop a social media app that would revolutionize how young people connect with their authentic selves. The app, which Jake insisted on naming Real Self, despite my gentle suggestions that the name might already be taken, was essentially a poorly designed copy of existing platforms with no unique features or user base. Jake hired his college roommate as a developer, despite the fact that neither of them had any programming experience beyond a single community college course. They outsourced the actual development to the cheapest overseas contractor they could find, resulting in an app that crashed constantly, leaked user data, and violated several App Store policies. When Apple rejected the app for the third time, Jake had already spent the entire $35,000 on business expenses that seemed to include a lot of expensive dinners, a new gaming setup for research purposes, and a designer wardrobe that he claimed was necessary for networking events. Once again, I got the phone call. This time, it was Dad. "Your brother is going through a rough patch," he said, using the same tone he'd used when I was 12, and he'd explained why we couldn't afford the school trip to Washington, D.C., the same trip that Jake later went on when his class had their turn. He's learned valuable lessons about the tech industry, and he's ready to apply that knowledge to something more practical. The something more practical turned out to be a drop-shipping business that Jake was convinced would make him a millionaire within 6 months. He'd watched YouTube videos about entrepreneurs who'd gotten rich selling products from China on Amazon, and he was certain he could replicate their success with minimal effort. By this point, I was in my senior year of college, working 3 part-time jobs while maintaining my GPA for graduate school applications. The last thing I wanted was to get drawn into another one of Jake's schemes, but the family pressure was relentless. "He's your brother," Mom would say during our weekly phone calls. "Blood is thicker than water, Sarah. Someday you'll understand the importance of family." The drop-shipping venture required $15,000 in startup capital, which my parents no longer had after the previous disasters. They'd already refinanced their house once to cover Jake's debts, and their credit cards were maxed out. This time, they needed a co-signer for a business loan, someone young with good credit and a stable income history. I was the only logical choice. Against every instinct I had, I co-signed that loan during Christmas break of my senior year. Jake promised he'd pay it back within 6 months, showed me spreadsheets full of projected profits, and even offered to pay me interest on the loan. Mom cried with relief, Dad actually hugged me, and for a brief moment, I felt like maybe I was finally being appreciated for my contributions to the family. The dropshipping business followed the same trajectory as Jake's previous ventures, just with more expensive mistakes. He chose products based on what he personally liked rather than market research, set prices too low to make any profit, and completely underestimated the logistics of customer service and returns. When customers started complaining about delayed shipments and defective products, Jake simply stopped responding to messages and eventually abandoned the business entirely. I was left with a $15,000 loan that would take me 3 years to pay off, plus the damage to my credit score when payments were missed during the transition period. Jake, meanwhile, moved on to his next brilliant idea, without any acknowledgement of the financial burden he'd left me carrying. That was 2 years ago, and I'd finally paid off that loan just last month. Every payment had been a reminder of how little my family valued me compared to their golden child. Every late notice, every credit score drop, every time I had to choose between groceries and loan payments, it all reinforced the same painful truth. I wasn't their daughter. I was their backup plan. But now, staring at those loan papers on the dining room table, I realized I finally had the power to change the script. They needed me more than I needed them, and for the first time in my life, I was going to use that leverage to my advantage. The plane ticket in my purse felt like a passport to freedom, and I was ready to use it. After college, I naively thought things would change. I'd proven myself academically, landed a good job at a Chicago marketing firm, and was finally financially independent. For about 6 months, I actually believed I might have earned some respect from my parents. I should have known better. The first sign that nothing had changed came when Jake announced his plans to open a craft brewery. He'd spent 3 months working at a local brewpub, and was convinced he'd mastered the industry. Never mind that he'd been fired from that job for consistently showing up late and arguing with customers. In Jake's version of events, he'd left because they couldn't handle his innovative ideas. "This is it, Sarah," Mom said during Sunday dinner, her eyes shining with the same delusional optimism she'd shown for all of Jake's previous ventures. "Jake has really found his calling this time. He understands the craft beer market better than anyone." I bit my tongue as Jake launched into his business plan, which seemed to consist entirely of brew beer that tastes better than everyone else's, and people will pay premium prices for authenticity. When Dad started talking about second mortgages and investor meetings, I excused myself to the bathroom and seriously considered climbing out the window. The brewery required $75,000 in startup capital. Jake had managed to convince 2 of his former college friends to invest $20,000 each, leaving my parents to cover the remaining $35,000. They'd already refinanced the house twice for his previous disasters, so this time they needed a different approach. "We're thinking of bringing you in as a partner," Dad announced, sliding a folder across the table with the kind of practiced casualness that told me this conversation had been rehearsed. 20% ownership for a $35,000 investment. You'd be getting in on the ground floor of something really special. I stared at the partnership agreement, noting that Jake would hold 60% ownership despite contributing exactly $0 to the venture. His friends would each get 10% for their investments, and I'd get 20% for putting up the same amount they'd paid for 50% combined. The math didn't add up, but challenging it would mean being unsupportive and negative. "I don't know anything about running a brewery," I said, trying to find a diplomatic way out of this obvious trap. You don't need to, Jake jumped in, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending patience he'd perfected over the years. You'd be a silent partner. We just need your financial contribution, and maybe some of that marketing expertise you're always talking about. The dismissive way he said, marketing expertise you're always talking about, made my teeth clench. I'd been working in marketing for 2 years, had already received 1 promotion, and was managing campaigns for clients with 6-figure budgets. But to Jake, my professional achievements were just something I had talked about, not real accomplishments worth respecting. Against my better judgment, I agreed to think about it. The pressure campaign that followed was relentless and sophisticated. Mom would call me at work with updates about Jake's progress securing permits and finding locations. Dad would forward me articles about the booming craft beer industry and the smart investors who were getting rich off small brewery investments. Even my aunts and uncles somehow knew about the opportunity and kept asking when I was going to help Jake make his dreams come true. The final straw was when my college roommate Jessica called me, confused. "Your mom reached out to me on Facebook," she said. "She wanted to know if I thought you were being selfish about not investing in Jake's brewery." "Sarah, what the hell is going on with your family?" That's when I realized they'd actually contacted my friends to pressure me into compliance. The violation of boundaries was so extreme that I actually laughed when Jessica told me about it. My own mother had tried to weaponize my friendships to manipulate me into funding my brother's latest disaster. I wrote the check that weekend, not because I believed in the brewery, but because I needed them to stop. The emotional exhaustion of constantly defending my financial decisions to my entire extended family wasn't worth $35,000, even if it meant eating ramen noodles for the next year to rebuild my savings. Jake's craft brewery lasted 14 months, which was actually longer than I'd expected. The problems were predictable. He'd chosen an expensive location without understanding foot traffic patterns, hired inexperienced staff because they were cheaper, and insisted on brewing experimental flavors that no one wanted to drink instead of mastering basic beer styles that customers actually ordered. The final nail in the coffin was when Jake decided to host a grand reopening event after a series of scathing Yelp reviews. Instead of addressing the legitimate complaints about service and beer quality, he'd hired a local band, decorated the space with expensive lighting, and invited every food blogger in Chicago. The event was supposed to prove that the negative reviews were wrong and generate buzz that would save the business. What it actually generated was the most brutal public humiliation I'd ever witnessed. The band was terrible, the new beer flavors were somehow worse than the old ones, and Jake spent the entire evening drunkenly arguing with customers who tried to give him feedback. 2 food bloggers walked out mid-event, and one of them wrote a scathing review that went viral on social media. The brewery closed 3 weeks later, and I lost every penny of my investment. Jake's response to this disaster was to blame Chicago's close-minded beer culture, and announce that he was moving to Portland to find a more supportive artistic community. My parents, who'd also lost their entire investment, somehow managed to make Jake's move my responsibility as well. "He needs a fresh start," Mom explained during the phone call where she asked me to help with his moving expenses. "Portland has such a thriving craft beer scene. This could be exactly what he needs to get back on his feet." "He just lost $75,000 of other people's money," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Maybe he should get a regular job and learn some responsibility before starting another business." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Sarah," Mom finally said, her voice cold in a way I'd rarely heard, "I'm disappointed in you. Jake is family. He's your brother. When family members are struggling, we help them. We don't tear them down." That conversation was 6 months ago, and it marked the beginning of my exit strategy. I'd realized that no matter what Jake did, no matter how much money he lost or how many people he hurt, my parents would always find a way to make his problems my responsibility. I was the perpetual safety net, the reliable daughter, who could always be counted on to sacrifice her own goals for the family's golden child. But safety nets only work if the person falling actually wants to be caught. Jake didn't want to be saved, he wanted to be enabled. And I was finally ready to stop catching him. The job offer from Portland, the same city where Jake had moved to find himself, felt like cosmic justice. While he was probably still living in some overpriced apartment, waiting for his next brilliant idea to strike, I was going to be building a real career with a company that actually valued my skills. The irony was perfect, and I was ready to embrace it. 3 months ago, my perspective on my family's financial dynamics shifted completely when I discovered the truth about my college fund. It was an accident, really. I was helping Mom organize old paperwork for their tax appointment when I found a folder marked Education Savings buried beneath a stack of insurance documents. Inside were statements from a $529 college savings plan that had been opened when I was 8 years old. My grandparents on Dad's side had contributed $500 every month for 10 years, and various relatives had made deposits for birthdays and holidays. By the time I graduated high school, there was over $87,000 in that account. I'd never seen a penny of it. Instead, I'd worked 3 jobs through college, taken out student loans, and graduated with $31,000 in debt that I'd spent the last 6 years paying off. I'd eaten ramen noodles and generic brand everything while my parents told me that college was my responsibility, and they couldn't afford to help. The account statements told a different story. The money had been withdrawn in 3 large chunks over 4 years, coinciding perfectly with Jake's business ventures. My college fund had paid for his food truck, his app development disaster, and his dropshipping scheme. While I was working overnight shifts at a warehouse to pay for textbooks, my own education savings were being funneled into my brother's entrepreneurial fantasies. I sat in Mom's living room, staring at those statements, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before, like someone had suddenly turned on all the lights in a house I'd been stumbling through in the dark. I took pictures of every statement with my phone, my hands shaking as I realized the full scope of what they'd done. They hadn't just failed to support my education. They'd actively stolen money that had been designated for that purpose and given it to Jake instead. When Mom came back from the kitchen with tea, she found me still holding the folder. "Oh, honey, that's just old paperwork," she said quickly, reaching for the folder with a nervous laugh. "I should have thrown that away years ago." "This is my college fund," I said quietly, not letting go of the documents. "Grandpa and Grandma set this up for me." Mom's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, defensiveness, and finally, resignation. "Sarah, you have to understand, Jake was in crisis," she began, settling into the same tone she'd used to justify every financial decision that had benefited him at my expense. "The money was just sitting there, and you were doing so well with your scholarships and jobs. We always intended to pay it back." "You stole my college fund," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I'd never used language that direct with my parents before. "We borrowed it," she corrected firmly. "Family money is family money, sweetie. When Jake's businesses start succeeding, we'll be able to pay back everything with interest." The delusion in that statement was breathtaking. Jake's businesses hadn't just failed, they'd failed spectacularly, leaving trails of debt and damaged relationships. The idea that he would ever be in a position to pay back everything with interest was pure fantasy. But what really broke something inside me was the casual way she'd said family money is family money. My college fund wasn't family money. It was my money, specifically saved for my education by grandparents who'd wanted to ensure I had opportunities they'd never had. They'd sacrificed to put that money aside, and my parents had stolen it to enable my brother's irresponsible dreams. I left that day without saying another word about the college fund, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in my life, I saw my parents clearly, not as the loving but misguided people I'd been making excuses for, but as manipulative enablers who'd systematically prioritized one child over another for decades. That night, I called my grandparents for the first time in months. Grandpa Pete was 84 and sharp as ever, and when I carefully asked about the college fund they'd set up for me, his confusion was immediate and obvious. "Of course we set up a college fund for you, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm with pride. "We started it when you turned 8, and we put money in there every month until you graduated. We were so proud when you got that scholarship, but we figured the fund money would help with living expenses and books and all those things scholarships don't cover." He had no idea the money had been stolen. In his mind, I'd used it for college expenses, which is exactly what it was intended for. My parents had never told him the truth about where that money had actually gone. "Did you ever get statements about the account?" I asked carefully. "Oh, your father handles all that," Grandpa said. "He told us you were so responsible with the money, using it wisely throughout college. We were just happy we could help." The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, with Grandpa sharing memories of opening that account and his hopes for my future. When we hung up, I sat in my apartment and cried, not just from anger, but from grief for the grandfather who'd sacrificed to help me and had no idea his generosity had been perverted into enabling my brother's failures. That's when I started planning my escape in earnest. I opened a new bank account at a different institution and began transferring money gradually, so there wouldn't be any obvious paper trail if my parents tried to guilt me into another family investment. I updated my direct deposit to go to the new account and changed all of my passwords. I also started researching job opportunities in other cities, focusing on positions that would represent significant career advancement. When the Portland offer came through, a senior marketing manager position with a $30,000 salary increase, I knew it was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. The job interview process took 6 weeks, during which I was careful not to mention anything to my family. I told them I was exploring some career options, but kept the details vague. The last thing I needed was their input on whether I should take a job that would put 2,000 miles between us. When I got the offer, I negotiated an additional week of vacation time and a signing bonus to cover moving expenses. I found an apartment online, scheduled the movers, and bought my plane ticket. Every step felt like breaking free from chains I hadn't even realized I was wearing. The only person I told about my plans was my friend Jessica, who'd been watching my family dynamics with increasing concern for years. "It's about time," she said when I explained what I'd discovered about the college fund. "Sarah, they've been financially abusing you for years. This isn't normal family stuff, this is systematic exploitation." Hearing someone else name what had been done to me was validating in a way I hadn't expected. Financial abuse wasn't something I'd ever considered, but when Jessica laid out the pattern, the stolen college fund, the manipulative loans, the emotional blackmail around family obligations, it was impossible to deny what had been happening. The plane ticket in my purse represented more than just a job change. It was my declaration of independence from a family system that had never valued me as anything more than a financial resource. And tonight's ambush with the loan papers was just the perfect final confirmation that I was making the right choice. They wanted me to sign those papers and take on another $40,000 in debt for Jake's latest scheme. What they didn't know was that by this time tomorrow, I'd be 2,000 miles away, starting a new life where my value wasn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice my financial future for someone else's dreams. The loan papers felt heavy in my hands as I pretended to read through the terms, though I already knew exactly what they contained. Jake's third business venture was going to be a revolutionary, food delivery app that would compete with DoorDash and Uber Eats. According to the business plan that Dad had proudly shown me, Jake was convinced he could capture market share by offering personalized dining experiences and artisanal meal curation. It was the most delusional business plan I'd ever seen. Jake had no experience in app development, no understanding of the logistics involved in food delivery, and no realistic grasp of the competition he'd be facing. His entire strategy seemed to be based on a single article he'd read about food delivery trends and his personal frustration with existing apps. He'd already convinced himself that success was inevitable and had started making promises to potential investors about returns that were mathematically impossible. The loan structure was even worse than I'd expected. As the primary borrower, I'd be responsible for the full $40,000 if the business failed, plus interest and fees. My parents would be co-signers, but their credit was already damaged from previous disasters, so the bank would come after me first. Jake wasn't even listed on the loan documents. He'd somehow convinced them that he couldn't be included because of his previous business setbacks, which was a polite way of saying his credit was completely destroyed. "So what do you think?" Mom asked, her voice carefully casual in the way that meant she was desperately hoping I'd agree without asking too many questions. I looked up at both of them, these two people who'd raised me to believe that family loyalty meant sacrificing my own well-being for their golden child. They were sitting there with expectant expressions, genuinely believing that I'd sign away my financial future for the third time because Jake had a new dream he wanted to pursue. What they couldn't see was that everything had changed. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment, and I was finally ready to break the cycle that had defined my entire life. "I need to ask you something first," I said, setting the papers down carefully. "Do you remember my college fund?" The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Dad's expression shifted from expectant to guarded, while Mom suddenly became very interested in the pattern on her napkin. "What about it?" Dad asked, his voice carrying a warning tone I recognized from childhood. "The $87,000 that Grandpa and Grandma saved for my education," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "The money that was supposed to help me through college so I wouldn't have to work 3 jobs and take out student loans." Mom's face had gone pale. "Sarah, that's ancient history. We've already discussed this." "No, we haven't," I said firmly. "We've never actually discussed it. You told me that family money is family money, and that you intended to pay it back someday. But we've never talked about what it felt like to discover that my own parents stole my college fund to enable Jake's business failures." The word "stole" hung in the air like a physical presence. I'd never used language that direct with them before, and the shock on their faces told me they'd never expected me to name their actions so bluntly. "Now wait just a minute," Dad began, his voice rising in the way it did when he felt his authority being challenged. "We made difficult decisions during difficult times. Jake needed support, and that money was available. We always planned to pay it back with the profits from Jake's successful businesses." I interrupted, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "Which business was going to pay it back, Dad?" "The food truck that lost $25,000. The app that never launched and cost $35,000. The craft brewery that burned through $75,000 and closed after 14 months. The numbers laid out like that were stark and undeniable. In the span of 6 years, Jake had lost $135,000 of other people's money pursuing fantasies that anyone with basic business sense could have predicted would fail. And that didn't even count the smaller amounts they'd funneled to him for living expenses, car repairs, and other emergencies that seemed to happen exclusively to Jake. "Those were learning experiences," Mom said desperately. "Jake has grown so much from those setbacks. This new venture is different. He's matured, and he really understands the market this time." The delusion in that statement was so complete that I actually felt sorry for her. After 6 years and $135,000 in losses, she still believed that Jake was on the verge of business success. She'd convinced herself that each failure was just another step toward inevitable triumph, rather than evidence that Jake had no business being an entrepreneur. "Mom," I said gently, "Jake is 30 years old. He's never held a regular job for more than 6 months. He's never taken responsibility for any of his failures. He's never paid back a single dollar of the money he's lost. What exactly makes you think this time will be different?" She stared at me as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. The idea that Jake might not be destined for entrepreneurial greatness was literally incomprehensible to her. "You know, this is exactly the kind of family drama that makes you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty and manipulation. If you're watching this and thinking about your own family dynamics, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been the responsible one who was expected to sacrifice for a sibling who never learned consequences? And if you're wondering how this confrontation ends, make sure you stay tuned because the next few minutes are going to reveal just how deep this manipulation goes. Dad tried a different approach. "Sarah, I understand you're frustrated, but family is family. We stick together through thick and thin. Your brother needs this opportunity, and you're in a position to help him. Someday when you need help, he'll be there for you too." The fantasy embedded in that statement was breathtaking. Jake had never been there for anyone but himself. When I'd been struggling to pay for college, working overnight shifts and eating ramen noodles, Jake had been living at home rent-free while pursuing his artistic vision. When I'd needed help moving apartments, Jake had been too busy with his latest business idea to even return my calls. When I'd been hospitalized with pneumonia 2 years ago, Jake had sent a get-well text from his vacation in Miami, a vacation funded by his brewery investor money. But Dad genuinely believed that Jake would eventually become the kind of person who helped others, despite 30 years of evidence to the contrary. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that belief was staggering. "When has Jake ever been there for me?" I asked quietly. "Give me one example of him sacrificing something he wanted to help me with something I needed." The silence stretched for nearly a minute. They couldn't think of a single example because there wasn't one. Jake's entire relationship with our family was transactional. He took what he needed and disappeared until the next crisis. "He's your brother," Mom finally whispered, as if that explained everything. "And I'm your daughter," I replied. But that's never seemed to matter when Jake needed something. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban street, where I'd grown up believing that family meant unconditional support and mutual sacrifice. What I'd actually learned was that family meant I was expected to give unconditionally while Jake was allowed to take endlessly. "I'm not signing those papers," I said, turning back to face them. The shock on their faces was complete. They'd been so certain of my compliance that they'd never even considered the possibility I might refuse. "But Jake is counting on this," Mom said, her voice breaking. "He's already made commitments to investors. He's put deposits down on equipment. Then Jake should have secured his funding before making commitments," I said. "That's what responsible business owners do." Dad's face was turning red with anger. "This is selfish, Sarah. This is not the daughter we raised." "You're right," I agreed. "The daughter you raised would have signed those papers without question, taken on another $40,000 in debt, and spent the next 5 years paying it off while Jake moved on to his next brilliant idea. But I'm not that person anymore." I reached into my purse and pulled out my plane ticket, setting it on the table next to the loan documents. The contrast was perfect, their attempt to trap me in another cycle of debt and obligation next to my ticket to freedom. "What is that?" Mom asked, though I could see the recognition dawning in her eyes. "That's my flight to Portland tomorrow morning," I said. "I got a job offer 6 weeks ago. Senior marketing manager position, $30,000 salary increase, full benefits. I start Monday. The silence that followed was deafening. The plane ticket seemed to glow on the dining room table, a small piece of paper that represented the complete destruction of their carefully laid plans. Mom stared at it like it was a venomous snake, while Dad's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that might have been panic. "You can't leave," Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't just abandon your family." The irony of that statement was so profound that I almost laughed. After 28 years of being treated as a financial resource rather than a family member, they were accusing me of abandonment for finally prioritizing my own life. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said calmly. "I am making a career decision that's best for my future. You know, the kind of responsible choice you always said you wanted me to make." Dad had recovered enough to shift into damage control mode. "Sarah, this is a mistake. You're making an emotional decision. Portland is expensive, you don't know anyone there, and this job could fall through. Here, you have family support, you have stability." "Stability?" I repeated, gesturing toward the loan papers. "You mean the stability of being your permanent backup plan? The stability of watching my credit score tank every time Jake has a brilliant idea." "We've made mistakes," Mom admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. "But we are a family. We work through problems together." That's when something inside me finally snapped. The years of gaslighting, the stolen college fund, the endless manipulation disguised as family loyalty, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "We don't work through problems together. You create problems with Jake's disasters, and then you expect me to solve them. There's a difference." I walked back to the table and picked up the loan documents, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness. "This loan, for example. Jake's name isn't even on it. He gets to pursue his dream with zero financial risk, while I take on $40,000 in debt that could destroy my credit if his business fails. Which it will, because Jake has never successfully completed anything in his entire life." "That's not fair," Dad protested. "Jake has learned from his mistakes." "Has he?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he's learned that no matter how badly he screws up, Mom and Dad will find a way to make Sarah fix it." I sat back down and looked at both of them directly, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. They weren't the loving but flawed parents I'd been making excuses for. They were people who'd systematically sacrificed one child's well-being to enable another child's irresponsibility. "Let me tell you what Jake has learned," I continued. "He's learned that he never has to face the consequences of his failures because you'll always find a way to blame someone else or make it someone else's problem. He's learned that he can make promises he has no intention of keeping because you'll convince someone else to fulfill them. He's learned that being irresponsible is actually quite profitable, as long as you have the right family dynamics." Mom was crying openly now, but her tears didn't move me the way they once would have. I'd seen her cry over Jake's problems too many times, watched her use emotional manipulation to get what she needed from me. "And what have I learned?" I asked. "I've learned that being responsible means being taken advantage of. I've learned that success makes me a target for other people's financial problems. I've learned that in this family, love is conditional on my willingness to sacrifice my own goals for Jake's dreams." "That's not true," Mom sobbed. "We love you just as much as we love Jake." "No, you don't," I said matter-of-factly. "You love what I can provide for Jake. You love that I'm reliable and responsible and always available to clean up his messes. But you've never loved me enough to protect me from his disasters." The truth of that statement hung in the air like a physical weight. I'd never said it out loud before, but I'd known it for years. Their love for me was transactional. As long as I fulfilled my role as the family safety net, they treated me with affection and approval. The moment I tried to establish boundaries or prioritize my own needs, that affection disappeared. Dad tried one more manipulation tactic. If you leave now, you'll regret it. Family is the only thing that really matters in life. Jobs come and go, but family is forever. You're right about one thing, I said, standing up again. Family is forever. That's why it's so tragic that you've spent 28 years treating me like a business partner instead of a daughter. I picked up my plane ticket and put it back in my purse, then looked at the loan documents one final time. The amount, $40,000, represented more than just money. It represented years of my life spent paying for someone else's irresponsibility, years of stress and financial pressure while Jake moved on to his next scheme. I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you, I said, my voice gentle but firm. I actually hope Jake's business succeeds this time. I hope he finally grows up and learns how to be responsible for his own life. But I'm not going to fund that possibility with my own financial future. So you're just going to walk away? Dad asked, his voice bitter. After everything we've done for you. The question revealed everything wrong with their perspective. In their minds, they'd been generous parents who'd sacrificed for their children. The reality was that they'd sacrificed one child to enable the other, then convinced themselves it was an act of love. I'm going to walk away from being financially abused, I corrected. I'm going to walk away from being manipulated and guilt into making decisions that hurt me. I'm going to walk away from a family dynamic that treats me like a resource instead of a person. I gathered my purse and jacket, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. Every step felt deliberate and necessary. Where will you stay tonight? Mom asked, suddenly practical. Your flight isn't until morning. I have a hotel room, I lied smoothly. The truth was that I was planning to spend the night at Jessica's apartment, but they didn't need to know that. The less information I gave them, the less opportunity they'd have to find new ways to manipulate me. Sarah, please, Mom tried one last time. Don't leave like this. We can work something out. Maybe Jake doesn't need the full $40,000. Maybe we can find other investors. Mom, I said gently, this isn't about the money. This is about 30 years of being treated as less important than Jake. This is about having my college fund stolen and being expected to be grateful for the opportunity to take on his debts. This is about never being seen as anything more than a solution to Jake's problems. I paused at the front door, looking back at the dining room where this confrontation had finally come to its inevitable conclusion. The loan papers were still scattered across the table, next to Mom's untouched lasagna and Dad's empty wine glass. It looked like the aftermath of a bomb explosion, which wasn't far from the truth. I want you to know that I don't hate you, I said, meaning it. I understand that you thought you were helping Jake by using me as a safety net. But I'm done being caught in that role. It's time for Jake to learn how to catch himself. The last thing I saw as I closed the door was Mom's stricken face and Dad's angry confusion. They still didn't understand what had just happened, but they would. When Jake's business inevitably failed and there was no one left to bail him out, they'd finally be forced to confront the monster they'd created through years of enabling. As I walked to my car, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete freedom from their expectations and manipulations. The guilt that had controlled me for so many years was gone, replaced by a sense of possibility that made me almost dizzy with relief. Tomorrow morning, I'd be on a plane to Portland, starting a life where my value wasn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice for someone else's dreams. Tonight, I was going to call Jessica and tell her that I'd finally done what she'd been encouraging me to do for years. I was going to choose myself for the first time in my life. Jessica's apartment had never felt more like a sanctuary than it did that night. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and immediately wrapped me in a hug that lasted several minutes. No questions, no demands for explanations, just the kind of unconditional support I'd spent years craving from my own family. I did it, I said simply, and she understood immediately. How do you feel? She asked, leading me to her couch and pressing a glass of wine into my hands. Terrified, I admitted. But also, free. I keep waiting for the guilt to hit, for that voice in my head that tells me I'm being selfish and terrible. But it's not coming. That's because you're not being selfish, Jessica said firmly. You're being healthy. There's a difference. We spent the next 3 hours talking through everything that had happened, from my discovery of the stolen college fund to the confrontation over the loan papers. Jessica listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me process what I'd experienced. The thing that gets me, I said around midnight, is that they still don't understand what they did wrong. Even when I laid it out for them, point by point, they still think this is about me being unsupportive rather than about years of financial abuse. Abusers rarely see themselves as abusers, Jessica pointed out. They've convinced themselves that their behavior is normal, maybe even generous. Admitting the truth would require them to confront some really ugly realities about themselves. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the evening, texts from Mom, missed calls from Dad, even a message from Jake that just said WTF Sarah. I'd turned off the notifications and put the phone in Jessica's kitchen drawer, but knowing it was there created a constant low-level anxiety. Do you want to read them? Jessica asked, noticing my glances toward the kitchen. Not tonight, I decided. Whatever they are saying, it's not going to change anything. My flight leaves at 9 a.m., and I need to focus on that. But curiosity got the better of me around 1 a.m., when Jessica had gone to bed, and I was lying on her couch staring at the ceiling. I retrieved my phone and immediately regretted it. The messages were exactly what I'd expected, but somehow worse. Mom's text started apologetic and gradually became more manipulative. Sarah, please come home so we can talk about this properly. I understand you're upset, but running away isn't the solution. Dad is having chest pains from the stress. This is affecting his health. Jake says his investors are threatening to pull out if he doesn't secure the loan by Friday. You're destroying his future. How can you be so cruel to your own family? The progression from apology to emotional blackmail was textbook manipulation, exactly the kind of thing that would have worked on me 6 months ago. Now, I could see it clearly for what it was, a desperate attempt to regain control over someone who'd finally broken free. Dad's messages were shorter, but more directly angry. This is the most selfish thing you've ever done. You're going to regret this decision for the rest of your life. Don't expect us to be here when your new job falls through. But Jake's message was the most revealing. Mom told me what happened. I can't believe you're screwing me over like this. I thought I could count on you, but I guess money is more important to you than family. Don't bother coming to my wedding when I get married because you won't be welcome. The entitlement in that message was staggering. Jake genuinely believed that I owed him access to my credit and financial future. The idea that I might have my own goals and plans that didn't revolve around enabling his latest scheme was literally incomprehensible to him. What struck me most was that none of them had asked about my new job, my move to Portland, or whether I was excited about this opportunity. They were so focused on what my decision meant for Jake that they'd completely ignored what it meant for me. Even in their attempts to guilt me into staying, I was still just a supporting character in Jake's story. I deleted all the messages without responding and blocked their numbers. There would be time later to decide whether I wanted to maintain any relationship with them, but right now I needed space to start my new life without their emotional manipulation. The next morning, Jessica drove me to the airport, chattering cheerfully about Portland's food scene and the hiking opportunities in Oregon. Her excitement for my new adventure was infectious, and by the time we reached the terminal, I was genuinely eager to begin this next chapter. "You're going to be amazing," she said as we hugged goodbye at security. "And you're going to be so much happier, without all that toxic family drama weighing you down." "I hope so," I said, meaning it. "I know so," she replied confidently. "Text me when you land, and send pictures of your new apartment. I want to live vicariously through your fresh start." The flight to Portland was surreal. I kept expecting to feel guilty or sad about leaving my family behind, but mostly I felt relief. With each mile between me and Chicago, the weight I'd been carrying for years grew lighter. I spent the flight reading about my new company and researching neighborhoods in Portland. The senior marketing manager position was everything I'd hoped for. Challenging projects, collaborative colleagues, and room for advancement that had been impossible at my previous job. The salary increase meant I'd be able to rebuild my savings quickly and maybe even start planning for long-term goals like buying a house or taking a real vacation. When the plane descended through Portland's cloudy sky, I looked down at the city that would be my new home and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope for my own future that wasn't contingent on anyone else's approval or success. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number as I waited for my luggage. For a moment, I worried that my family had found a way around the block, but it was actually my new supervisor welcoming me to Portland and confirming our Monday morning meeting. "Looking forward to having you on the team," the message read. "I think you're going to love it here." As I collected my suitcases and headed toward the rental car counter, I realized that someone was finally excited about my potential rather than my utility. Someone saw me as an asset to be developed rather than a resource to be exploited. The contrast with my family's reaction couldn't have been more stark, and it reinforced that I had made exactly the right choice. 6 months later, I was sitting in my Portland apartment, rain pattering against the windows, when Jessica called with news that made my coffee taste even sweeter. "You're not going to believe this," she said, barely containing her laughter. "I ran into your mom at the grocery store yesterday." My stomach tightened reflexively. Old habits die hard, but I was surprised to find that the anxiety passed quickly. "How did that go?" "Well, first she tried to guilt me about not giving her your new address. When that didn't work, she started telling me about Jake's latest disaster, clearly hoping I'd pass the information along to you." I set down my coffee cup, genuinely curious despite myself. "What happened to the food delivery app?" "Oh, Sarah," Jessica's voice was rich with schadenfreude. "It never even launched. Turns out Jake spent 6 months trying to secure funding, but no legitimate investor would touch him. His credit is so destroyed that he couldn't even get a business credit card." The irony was perfect. If I'd signed those loan papers, Jake would have had his $40,000 to waste on another doomed venture. Instead, he'd been forced to confront the reality that his track record made him uninvestable. "But here's the best part," Jessica continued. "Without you there to bail them out, your parents finally had to face the truth about their golden child. Jake moved back in with them when he couldn't make rent, and apparently he's been living there for 4 months now, unemployed and spending his days playing video games. I tried to feel sorry for my parents, but mostly I felt vindicated. 4 years, they'd enabled Jake's irresponsibility by using me as their safety net. Now they were experiencing firsthand what it was like to support his lifestyle without my financial contributions." "Your mom looked exhausted," Jessica added. "She kept talking about how stressed she is, how Jake needs to find his direction, how difficult everything has become. I almost felt bad for her until she started hinting that maybe you'd learned your lesson and would be ready to come home and help the family soon." The audacity of that expectation was breathtaking but not surprising. Even after 6 months of experiencing the consequences of their choices, they still believed I'd eventually return to my role as the family scapegoat. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that you're thriving in Portland, that you love your job, and that you seem happier than you've ever been. Which is true, by the way. The change in you since you moved has been incredible. Jessica was right. The past 6 months had been transformative in ways I hadn't expected. Without the constant stress of family financial drama, I'd discovered parts of myself that had been buried for years. I'd joined a hiking group, taken a pottery class, and even started dating someone I'd met through work, a software developer named Marcus, who was refreshingly stable and drama-free. My career had flourished too. The marketing campaigns I'd developed had exceeded all expectations, and my supervisor had already hinted at additional advancement opportunities. For the first time in my professional life, I was being recognized for my skills rather than being seen as a reliable but unremarkable employee. "There's more," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Apparently your parents had to take out a second mortgage to cover some of Jake's debts that came due. They are really struggling financially now." The old Sarah would have felt guilty hearing that. The old Sarah would have started calculating whether she could afford to help, would have convinced herself that maybe this time would be different, would have found a way to justify taking on their problems as her own. The new Sarah felt something much healthier, sympathy for their situation combined with firm boundaries around my own well-being. "That's unfortunate," I said, and meant it. "But it's also the natural consequence of 30 years of poor financial decisions." "Your mom seemed shocked that you haven't reached out," Jessica continued. "She kept saying things like, 'I just don't understand how Sarah can be so heartless, and family is supposed to stick together.' I think she genuinely believes you'll cave eventually." "She's going to be disappointed," I said with a certainty that surprised me. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined maintaining no contact with my family for this long. Now, the idea of voluntarily returning to their dysfunction seemed absurd. "How do you feel about all this?" Jessica asked, her voice gentler now. I considered the question seriously. How did I feel about my parents struggling financially while I thrived in my new life? How did I feel about Jake facing consequences for the first time in his adult life? How did I feel about the family system that had exploited me for decades finally collapsing without my support? "I feel free," I said finally. For 28 years, their problems were my problems. Their crises became my emergencies. Their poor decisions became my financial obligations. Now their problems are just their problems, and I'm living my own life for the first time ever. And you don't miss them at all. I miss the family I thought we were, I admitted. I miss the fantasy of having parents who prioritized my well-being equally with Jake's. But I don't miss the reality of being their perpetual safety net. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Portland skyline, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed. The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight was filtering through the clouds, making the wet streets shimmer. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking if I wanted to try a new restaurant that had just opened downtown. 6 months ago, I would have been checking my bank balance before agreeing to dinner out, calculating whether I could afford it after factoring in potential family emergencies. Now, I could say yes without hesitation because my money was my own. You know, when I started this story, I never imagined it would end with me feeling grateful for my family's betrayal. But their attempt to manipulate me into that final loan was actually the push I needed to break free from decades of financial abuse. Sometimes the best revenge isn't plotting against people who've wronged you, it's simply refusing to let them wrong you anymore. I'm curious about your own experiences with family financial drama. Have you ever been the responsible one who was expected to sacrifice for a sibling who never learned consequences? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own financial security? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear how others have handled these impossible situations. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well despite the people who tried to hold you back. As I got ready for dinner with Marcus, I reflected on the perfect karma of my situation. My parents had tried to trap me in another cycle of debt and obligation, but their ambush had actually been the catalyst for my escape. They'd thought they were manipulating me into compliance, but they'd actually handed me the motivation I needed to choose myself for the first time. Jake was learning that actions have consequences, my parents were discovering what it really cost to enable his lifestyle, and I was building a life where my value wasn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice for others. The plane ticket I'd hidden in my purse that night had been more than just transportation to a new job. It had been my ticket to freedom from a family system that had never truly valued me. And the best part was that I hadn't had to plot against them or actively seek revenge. I'd simply stopped participating in their dysfunction, and their whole house of cards had collapsed on its own. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is just refusing to be a victim anymore. If you've stuck with me through this whole crazy family saga, thank you for listening. Life has taught me that we can't choose our family, but we can choose how much power we give them over our happiness and financial security. I chose freedom, and I've never been happier. What choice would you have made in my situation? Let me know in the comments. Give this video a thumbs up if it made you think about your own family dynamics. And don't forget to subscribe and share this story with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to put their own well-being first. Thanks for being part of my journey, and I hope my story helps someone else find the courage to choose themselves too.